Okay, guys, this is slide one in our Industrial Revolution unit as we start a new story here. Actually, we're continuing a story. These first three units that we've done, Reconstruction, Westward Expansion, and now Industrial Revolution, all chronologically take place at the same time. We're just looking at what's going on in three different parts of the country at the same time. Obviously, Reconstruction focuses on the South. The westward expansion obviously focuses on the West. And that leaves the North, the Northeast, the industrial Northeast for our Industrial Revolution unit. So again, all at the same time, just three different parts of the country. And this unit kind of focuses on the move to the cities and the move to machine-made things and machine-powered things, the move to factories, the shift from handmade goods to machine-made goods. This is really sort of the second industrial revolution. The first one happened much earlier when we moved to steam-powered goods and machinery and so forth. Now this one will take the next step and look at sort of gasoline-powered goods. Eventually, we'll get there, but that's one of the big developments that comes out of this. The internal combustion engine. We'll look at the invention of the assembly line to build products. So lots of different things. We'll talk about a lot of people in this unit specifically, a lot of inventors and the things they invented and kind of how those things shaped America at the time and the world. Because this is really the time where the United States becomes the world leader. We will produce more goods ultimately than the rest of the world combined. Well, that all starts now. Because of the Industrial Revolution. And that's mainly due in large part to our natural resources that we have. Now we're going to be talking about three main areas here in this unit and some offshoots of each, but three main areas. Oil, steel, and we will start with the growth of the railroads. Right? Just to give you some numbers here, you don't have to know these, but it will give you a good idea of kind of how the Industrial Revolution fuels the growth of this country. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, there were 35,000 miles of railroads in this country. 35,000 in 1865. Just 35 years later, by 1900, by the end of the century, that 35,000 had jumped to 192,000 miles. So from 35,000 to 192,000 miles in just 35 years. And we'll talk about what makes that possible. Okay? One of the things is land and loans. If you're going to build railroads, you need land to build them on, and you need money to build them. The federal government was all too happy to step up and contribute land for the growth of railroads, particularly in the West, because remember, they're trying to settle the West, and one way they can settle the West is to make it easier for people to get there. So Congress, the federal government, gave over 155 billion acres to railroad companies. 155 billion acres. Just gave it away to the railroad companies if they would agree to build railroads. Western states contributed state lands to the railroads. It was a big economic boom. If the railroad came through your state, towns often fought over who was going to get the railroad and who wasn't. So the fact that railroad companies were given land made it much easier to build. They were also given very cheap loans, low interest loans to help build the railroads. So federal government's doing its part, banks are doing their part, but they're not doing it just out of the kindness of their heart. The government, the banks are going to make money on interest, but the federal government's going to want something in exchange for all this land they're giving away, and they get it. Once the railroads get built, the government gets very preferential rates, very cheap rates when using the railroad. And there were two big things they used the railroad for. Postal services, to move the mail across the country, to move packages across the country and so forth, and military usage, to move troops across the country. We talked about the fact that the railroads were one of the things that doomed the Indians in the wars. So in exchange for all this land the federal government's given away, they're going to expect something in return. And they're going to get cheap rates on postal usage for the trains and military usage for the trains. Okay. Now, let's talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. There had long been, for probably 35 years or so, long been a debate and a talk of building a transcontinental railroad from coast to coast. There were already lots of railroads in the east, lots of railroads. There were even some railroads in the Midwest, as far west as Omaha, connecting it to Chicago and Kansas City and so forth. But that's as far as they went. Talk was, we need to connect the coasts. But the great debate was whether it was going to be a northern, or primarily a northern railroad, or a southern one that went through northern states or southern states. When the South seceded and started the Civil War, that decision was made. It would go through the northern states because the South didn't have money to build a transcontinental railroad. So you see the route on the map there that the transcontinental railroad would take. The North was eager to bring more states into the Union on their terms rather than Southern terms. Also more gold. There was gold in the western mountains, and the northern the government, federal government, wanted that gold. So you see the route there on the map running through the northern, primarily northern states. California, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, almost down into Colorado there, Nebraska and so forth. So all northern states. Okay? Now let's talk about how the railroad gets built. Okay? Contracts are given to two different companies, and they'll start on two ends and work toward each other to meet in the middle. The first company was called the Union Pacific. Okay? The Union Pacific. Okay? It would start in Omaha, right here in Nebraska, okay? And they would head west, starting in the Midwest and heading west. Okay? Work for the Union Pacific was done mainly by Irish immigrants. Okay? When the Civil War ends, there's also a lot of soldiers looking for work, so you get some Civil War veterans, but mainly immigrants are the ones going to build the railroad for both companies. And for the Union Pacific, it's Irish immigrants, starting in Omaha and heading to the west. The second company will be the Central Pacific. Okay? And the Central Pacific will start in Sacramento, California, right there, and they will head east. Right? Most of this work is done by Chinese immigrants for the Central Pacific. And you can tell there's already a little bitty piece of track here. Sacramento was the capital of California, so there was already some railroads connecting the capital to other California cities, particularly on the coast. So they didn't have to go all the way to the coast. They already had coast to the capital. But it starts in Sacramento and heads east. So you got the Central Pacific here, you got the Union Pacific here. Okay? Now, a quick little, before we talk about the completion and all of that, Quick little diversion here. The Central Pacific is owned by a group of investors known collectively as the Big Four. Okay? And the biggest of the Big Four would be this guy you see right down here in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. His name is Leland Stanford, Stanford, Leland Stanford. He was a former governor of California, an extremely wealthy businessman. He would be the largest investor in the Central Pacific. And for his work on the trains there, his influence in California, his time as governor and all of that, he would found and have named after him Stanford University. Right? So Leland Stanford, the biggest of the Big Four. Okay. All right, let's talk about the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, thinking Central Pacific. The Transcontinental Railroad. This was a huge deal when it was completed. Okay? It was finished in 1869 at, if you see on the map here, the meeting place there, Promontory Point, Utah. It's just north of, if you can tell the little bitty blue right there, just north of Great Salt Lake in Salt Lake City. Promontory Point, Utah is where the two sides met. Okay? There was a huge ceremony. The leaders, the governors of all the states that it went through, the owners of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific were there, the engineers that designed it, some of the workers. There was a big ceremony. They drove a ceremonial final spike into the railroad to complete it. That ceremonial final spike was made of gold because ultimately what drove settlers to the west, gold did. The prospect of getting rich. So if gold was what started this settling to the west, we're going to have a symbolic gold, well, it was actual gold spike to symbolize gold's involvement in the settling of the west here. Now, as soon as the ceremony was over, the gold spike was taken out of the ground and put in a museum. Otherwise, somebody shows up and steals the gold spike. So it's all ceremonial. They drive it, and then they take it out, and they go put it in a museum somewhere. But that's 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, if you look at the map here, okay, the Central Pacific, and again, that's this part right here, okay, built 689 miles of track, or they laid 689 miles of track, the Central Pacific. Remember, these are Chinese immigrants. The Irish immigrants over here, right, laid 1,086 miles of track. So you got 689 and 1,086. Now, does that mean that the Chinese are that much better at building railroads than the Irish? No, it doesn't. It has to do with, think about it, look at the map, why would there be more track laid on this side than that side? Given that they both started roughly the same time, they didn't have a big head start over here or anything. It's geography. Okay? Most of the Union Pacific's track was laid over plains, the Great Plains, flat, wide, open prairie land. You get into the Rocky Mountains here, but they actually don't go quite that far west. The Central Pacific, on the other hand, had to deal with two mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevadas here, the Rocky Mountains here, and desert in between. So it's, as you can imagine, it's much easier to lay track over a flat, open prairie than it is two mountain ranges and desert. Right? As a result, the Central Pacific workers got paid more than the Union Pacific workers. They had a harder job. They did a lot more work. So, there you go. Very big deal here, the Transcontinental Railroad. This just starts our discussion of the railroads, though. Our next two slides will deal with that also.